Okay, past 7 o'clock, I guess it's time to get going here. So my name is Paul Johnson. I've been doing legislative lobbying work since 1980. I spent the first 15 years really working on poverty programs, social service programs. Since that time, I've done some work and wrote some white papers on foreign policy and affordable housing. In the last 5 years, I've been doing an e-report for the League of Women Voters of Kansas. And I'm a liaison for them. I think you need to know that I'm not registered as a lobbyist for the League, and I don't speak for the League. I am registered as a lobbyist for the Kansas Rural Center in Kansas. And we work on water policy and environmental policy and local food issues, and I'll touch on a little of that at this later in the discussion. My plan tonight is probably to talk maybe about 40 minutes and cover a number of issues before the state legislature at this point, and then we'll open up for questions. And I should say off the top, it's hard to be an expert on all the issues that come before the Kansas legislature. I know a lot of you have special understandings and involvement with these various programs, so I'm respectful of that. I cover a lot of things. I'm a couple inches, deep and not, so I do the best I can to try and get to the high points, but I'm going to try and give you a lay of the land, of the key issues before the legislature. I'm going to start with the budget/revenue. It's really hard to divide those two and where we're at and the struggle we're having with that. I want to touch on some utility and energy issues, on water, agriculture, election and voter registration issues, and some social service issues. And as we know, as we're sitting here right now, we have an unfinished circus going on in Topeka, and I see I have a couple of experts on the back row that will probably keep me very in tune to the polemics that I may throw out at this point. And I think the one reality about the Kansas budget, and what you have to understand by Constitution-wise, we cannot deficit finance. You cannot pass a budget that's imbalanced, as opposed to what the federal government can do with deficit financing. So that really forces the issue to get the revenue and budget issues in line. And needless to say, we have the most conservative governor and state legislature that we've had, I don't know, forever, but in the last 70 years, for the people who've been elected, Governor Brownback is incredibly conservative, and with the money that his friends put into it to take over the state Senate in 2012, and defeating a number of House Democrats in 2010, we really have a pretty imbalanced state legislature at this point, as far as what you saw with Graves, what you saw with Mike Hayden, what you saw with other administrations years ago. The climate, the tone is really much different today. So we've really been looking at about 6 years of budget cuts. And on the revenue side, if you looked at, and you can go back much further, but if you take the 1960 to 2000 period of time, our state had only 2 years in that 40 years where we actually there was less revenue coming into the state. And that was only about 1%. And then the next year after that, it popped right back up. Our deficits in revenues started, our first major one was in 2002, and started the Sebelius administration, and we went down 7% at that point. Then the Great Recession started in 08, 09, and 10, and Sebelius and Parkinson, had to scramble to figure that out at this point. Brownback gets elected, makes some very, serious budget decisions that he wants to do away with the income tax, and so when we get to 2014, our drop went over almost 10%. Now, when we're talking about a state budget, we're talking $15 to $15.5 billion. When you divide that by 3 million Kansans, you're looking at about $5,000 per person, to put it into some kind of perspective. And this is a bit of a budget primary, and I'm going to get down into the weeds at times on some of this. But probably the most important part of the state budget is what's called the state general fund. So out of that $15 billion that of the whole state budget, $6 billion of it is the state general fund. That's really the part of the budget where the state legislature spends most of the time. That's where you get the primary funding for schools and for regents and for state operations as such. That's really what they're battling over. The other $9 billion is quite a mix. It's our Medicaid match. We spend 40 cents out of the state general fund for Medicaid. We get 60 cents back from the federal government. So that's kind of the other part. There's also some transportation. We have some sales tax that never touches the state general fund. It goes into the other part to fund highways. Research dollars that come into our universities are part of that mix. So it's the $6 billion that's really probably the key part. So how do we spend $6 billion? Well, half of it goes for K through 12 at this point. Another 11 to 12% now goes for higher education. 7 years ago, that was 15%. We've seen quite a drop in what we're spending in community colleges and universities. And then another 20% is human services. I think when you hear the word human services, you should hear the word Medicaid, because 90% of human services spending in our state is the Medicaid program, which we now call CanCare. So that's really the thing. And then 18% of the budget goes for everything else: prisons, state hospitals, agriculture, natural resources, on down the line. So Sebelius and Parkinson were in a position where they had to deal with budget cuts, starting with the Great Recession. So how do you do that? Well, they started reaching in and took ending balances. Kansas has always tried to have 6 or 7% as an ending balance to kind of keep the checkbook level. So that's one-time money that was spent. We also, and we could get into a lot of detail about this, but the state government has made a lot of promises to local units of government for different items to help them fund certain transportation, property tax, and a few other items. And when deficits start to show up the state level, then the state cuts off that assistance to city and county governments. And, people, Boog here could talk a lot about what he saw, at the Lawrence City Council at this point. Another thing that went and that was cut back was our contributions to KPERS, which is the Kansas Public Employee Retirement System. So, and that's a whole subject we could spend all night on, just talking about where KPERS is at, why has it had such problems, and how are we going to fix it. But part of the problem is that the state has neglected payments, proper payments to KPERS many times over the years when they've hit a deficit. And then we had some one-time gimmicks. Maybe a few years ago you might remember that we moved payment of property tax from July into May. We got $150 million, and that was a one-time gimmick, And then we have unfilled positions, which is probably more problematic. SRS when we had it, now it's DCF, Health Department, Health and Environment, etc. All these agencies were really underfunded many times, and they kept positions open, but they didn't have a budget to fill. They couldn't fill the position. So that was a way to. And the other thing that happened with Sebelius and Parkinson is that they backed down from what the court had ordered on K through 12 funding. We got close to about $4,300 per student in the state of Kansas. And then as the deficits started to roll in, we've rolled that back to about $3,850 at this point. So that's, so Brownback comes in, and his promise is that we're going to double down on cuts to pay for income tax reductions. And it's a victory for a lot of conservatives in Topeka that if you downsize government, regardless of what government does, that's a victory. And that's been the policy at this. We We ended the General Assistance Program. I know many of you remember that for a few decades. It was a state-funded program for adults without children, had disabilities, had problems. That was gone. Brownback looked over and said, I need this much money to start paying for some tax cuts. Here's the 10% you're going to have to deal with. And he basically put that out to state agencies and said, I need a 10% cut. And we didn't have subcommittees that stepped up and said, well, we're going to have enough social workers, we have enough child protective workers, are we going to have enough people to look at confined animal feeding operations in the state, et cetera, et cetera. That was secondary. We needed the money, needed the cuts, and that happened. We privatized the Medicaid program. Now it's called CanCare. And I think to their credit to some point is that they didn't think that they were going to make massive savings with doing this with Medicaid. What they wanted to do was slow the growth at this point. And for the first 2 years, we've had 3 private managed care organizations running CanCare. They've lost $100 million the first year and tens of millions this last year. So we're going to see how this experiment plays out. And another thing, you know, and this is another debatable part of how you count funding, but Brownback said that, you know, we're putting money into the CAPERS programs on the part of school employees. So should you count that as part of all of school finance? And when you know, so it's true that we need to shore up CAPERS for those school employees, but the reality is that that's not money that's going to get into a classroom. That's not going to hire a teacher or an aide or a nurse or whatever. So I'm going to shift to the revenue side here a little bit. I think the real key year for the revenue changes that we should talk about is 1992. And that's when there was a massive change at the state level to deal with school funding. Up to that point, schools were predominantly funded by property taxes in our state, and it was unequal across a whole array of counties in that. So we wanted to bring some equity and get a funding base built for that. So in 1992, we basically ratcheted down a lot of property tax around the state, and we replaced it with income and sales tax as a way. And Graves' philosophy was that we needed a balanced tax plan, and you'll see this in league positions. And what they were striving at was to get 1/3 of it would come from property, 1/3 would come from income, and 1/3 would come from sales tax. And we got close to that in the mid-90s in Kansas. Then the tech bubble evolved. Things were very flush. Graves decided that we had more money than we needed. It was time to cut, you know, that we could afford some tax cuts at that point. So he did one thing he did was when the initial school funding formula was passed in 1992, the statewide average to be paid mill levy wise for schools was 35 mills. After we got done cutting taxes in the late 90s, we cut it to 20 mills. And we haven't changed that in terms of school funding. We also got to that, you know, with the help of Therese Bangert and some Catholics and some other people, is Kansas put in a refundable state earned income tax credit. And we were only the 5th or 6th state in the country to do that to help with the working poor. So Brownback comes in and thinks that we can take away 30% of our revenue source, which is the income tax, and somehow we're going to work with more economic growth and more sales tax, we're going to cover that loss at this point. And part of the discussion was we had a lost decade in 2000 to 2010. Kansas didn't grow very much, not many new jobs, whatever. What I don't hear the other party saying, or different people, is that we tried this at the national level. When President Bush came in 2000, that was his promise to give back money, give it, you know, and tax breaks. So we did that. And we were nationwide, we were on the verge of really dealing with our national debt. Well, during Bush's 8 years, he almost didn't add any new jobs when you look at the numbers. So why we think Kansas was going to be a different player in that scenario, where 1%, 3 million out of 300 million, how much more, what's our economic destiny tied to? But Brownback said there's about 10 states that don't have an income tax, and they're growing, and we ought to emulate that. Well, you look at a few of them, you have real questions. One's Florida, doesn't have an income tax. Well, they got water, and they got Disneyland, and they got tourism, and they got other resources. Texas, Wyoming, a couple other states have incredible resource bases, oil, coal, that. Kansas just didn't have some of those amenities to make up for them. So we started the income tax cuts in 2012 and 2013 to bring down the income tax rates. And along with that, we decided that we were going to eliminate immediately. Now, we're going to phase down these rates over a period of time, but we decided what we're going to do at the same time is eliminate non-wage business income in the state of Kansas. And when they made the first guess at how much that was going to cost, Revenue said, well, we think it's going to apply to 192,000 business filers in the state of Kansas. That was 2009 federal income tax. Well, today now we know that it's 333,000 people that are benefiting from LLCs, subchapter S's, sole proprietorships, farmers. The guess when they rolled this out was it might cost us $160 million a year. Today we're sitting at somewhere between 210 and 220 million. And they tout it as a small business break, that it's really to help small business to get them going. Well, the numbers don't bear that out. If you start at $100,000 to 250,000, 250,000 to 500,000, 500,000 to God knows how high, those filers represent 5% of the 330,000 LLCs, subchapter S's, 5%, they get 70% of the tax breaks. They get $168 million out of $205 million that it cost in 2013. So our job growth has not been spectacular. We're not setting records. We're not doing that much better in our region, let alone nationally. And our sales tax has not exploded, which is what they thought would do to cover it. Okay, that's the revenue. I'm going to get into, I think, what I would call budget and policy gimmicks that are really troubling at this point. And this started a year ago with the judicial budget in Kansas. So certain senators said, okay, and the judiciary's been having its problems. The filing fees haven't been coming in. They've been struggling financially, and they needed some extra money. So the senators said, well, we're willing we'll up some fees, filing fees and court fees, et cetera, and we'll put in a little more SGF, State General Fund money, to help you. But to do that, we want these policy changes to go along. So you put them into the same bill. Now we have 31 judicial districts in the state of Kansas. And I'm no lawyer and I'm no constitutional expert, but what I read is that the judicial branch ought to be controlling itself, that it's self-governing, that it is the one that makes decisions on administration, whatever. And it used to be a streamlined statewide system. So the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court would help with selection of the 31 chief judges in these 31 regions, and they would deal with budgets, and they would package it together. But our state senators decided that we wanted local control. If school boards can control their own budgets, they can pick their own people, then why can't each one of these 31 judicial districts do it as well? And now, this year, they're doubling down on this. They want to keep those same policies, and they've tied the same budget together in terms of funding. But now the senators have decided that they're going to put in a non-severability clause. This is in House Bill 2005, and what it says, and by the way, there's a judge from Kingman County who has filed a lawsuit challenging the policy questions, whether the legislature had the right to make these changes. So now we have a non-severability clause within this budget that says, if the courts overturn our policy changes, we're going to negate your budget. Your budget goes away, and then we're going to have a special session, maybe. We're going to have to do something different, too. Good question. Who's the referee in all this? I mean, where is the checks and balances and constitutionality of who makes these decisions? So we did that with the judicial budget. Then we thought it was good enough for them, we'd do it for the schools. That would be good. So to fund the schools, here's the policy stuff you're going to have to swallow to go along with it. Part of it was dealt with teachers, not whether they would get an administrative hearing or some protection, in firing or disciplinary actions. Some of it was, can we give corporations, if they donate to private schools, parochial schools, whatever, can they get a tax break? They can get tax breaks for helping low-income students. They decided that we need innovative districts in the state of Kansas. So an innovative district, if approved, can ignore all rules and regulations. I mean, they can have anybody teaching English at this point. Well, so there's real questions going forward as to what is the purpose of our State Board of Education. It's elected, what role does it play at this point? And there's also a real and there's a new bill that was just introduced, Senate Bill 311, that will take the disbursement of school aid away from the State Department of Education and give it to the governor's office, which has been filed here, hasn't had a hearing yet. Then the question is, what's the courts going to do about this? The state constitution says that there has to be provision for resources for suitable education. Who defines that? Who enforces it? What would the legislature do? In 2006, they said you've got to spend this much more money. Today, how would the legislature respond to that? And we may know on this Friday. There's a 3-panel district court judges in Shawnee County that may rule by Friday as to where we're at with adequacy and equity of school funding in Kansas. Okay, I'm going to turn to some issues here that I'm going to talk with social services a little bit. The conservatives have decided that we can't have a discussion on expanding Medicaid in the state of Kansas. That's too much for our civic dialogue, I guess, at this point. We have something like 300 to 350,000 Kansans that are completely uninsured with medical care. If we expanded Medicaid in Kansas, we could cover probably 150,000 of those folks. The hospitals are desperate for it. Our rural hospitals, as the Affordable Care Act continues to be implemented, what they used to get in terms of covering compensated care for the uninsured is starting to go down, because the theory was that Medicaid would go up and it would help fill that thing. Well, Kansas is one of a couple dozen states that hasn't expanded Medicaid, and I think the rural hospitals, I think that's probably what it's going to take as a wake-up call in the state, is for us to see a half a dozen rural hospitals just go under to mental health coverage is something that has just been bludgeoned by this administration. We have a law on the books that says that we have community mental health centers all across the state. Well, the community mental health centers are by law mandated to serve everybody who walks in their door. Uninsured, everybody. And what we used to do in Kansas is come up with some state money as a way to cover some of that uncompensated cost. Budget deficits, looking for places to take money, that's just drifted away. And probably the biggest thing that could happen for mental health in our state is expansion of Medicaid, quite honestly. And that would make the difference. I could spend a long time talking about the temporary assistance for needy families. It used to be the old AFDC program. It's our basic program for our poorest families and children at this point. This administration has been on a tear to try and reduce those numbers and call it a victory. We had 37,000 women and children, and 70% of these are children, on this program in 2011. Today we have 14,000. It's a 60% reduction in the last 4 or 5 years. And we don't have a clue what's happened to these kids. We don't do any tracking. We have a record number of kids in foster care. And we don't do any tracking, Do the Social Security numbers match of the 15,000 TANF kids that no longer are covered? How many of those are showing up in more expensive settings? I could talk a lot. Daycare the same way. We want people to work, and that's great. We want to give them employment assistance. It would seem like if we're really actively doing that with hard-to-serve mothers, that they would need some help with child care assistance. We went from 19,000 slots in 2011. We're down to 12,000 today. And the crime of all this is that we have $40 million sitting in the ending balance of our TANF program. Our state spends $62 million a year. We get $101 million from the feds. That hasn't changed since 1996 when it was passed, when Clinton signed it. And we haven't raised the TANF per person rate since that time. We haven't, all right, that's TANF. I'll talk about energy and utilities a little bit. Mark Parkinson signed a law that set up in Kansas a renewable portfolio standard for supplying renewable energy in the state of Kansas. And I don't think we can overestimate just what kind of expansion we've seen with renewable energy in our state in the last 15 years. Today we have 20 operating wind farms across the state. We have 7 under construction and a lot of interest. We went from 0 to 2,000 megawatts of wind energy. And the renewable portfolio goal was to hit 20% of our peak electricity supplied by renewable energy by 2020. We're already there. And the Koch brothers, Americans for Prosperity, the Chamber, they've gone after this 4 years to kill it. And they couldn't do it until this year. So now this year, we've decided that we don't have a standard anymore, we have a goal. and the goal's not even higher than 20%. The goal's not 25 or 40% that we should be at, it's 20%. So we've met the goal. So what work or effort are we going to do it? And the trade-off for why that happened is how much should wind farms pay in property tax? And when we passed the law, we gave there was no property tax for these wind farms. But the wind farms worked with the counties they're in and worked up payment in lieu of taxes. People now are worrying going forward what's going to happen to new wind farms. And if they're online by, I think, 2016, ask Marcy to verify this, then they're still covered by they're not paying property taxes. But those after that will be on a 10-year cycle where they won't be paid property taxes and then we'll start paying. Is that right? Okay. The other piece in what's happening in Kansas around energy that I think is pretty vital is they passed a bill last year dealing with net metering. Net metering gets into the game about if you're producing power, if you have a small wind system, which most people don't, but mostly solar panels, and you're generating power like Marjorie does. What's a fair rate for power that you sell back to the utility, and how do you find that balance at this point? A lot of states have what's called a whole or complete net metering, which means whatever I pay to Westar, if I sell them a kilowatt hour back, they pay me the same amount. We didn't get that in Kansas at this point, but probably more troubling is that we passed a piece of legislation that's going to leave it up to the Kansas Corporation Commission, which regulates our utilities, to say what's a fair net metering policy and what's a fair fee or hookup fees or that. Well, Westar has filed a rate increase, so we're going to see that this summer. Under their rate increase, they're going to force all solar generators to pay much higher rates. That what they have to pay for their monthly hookup is going to be significantly higher. And Cromwell and friends are already intervening in this rate case to see where this battle goes at this point. The last thing on energy and utilities is that we've passed a plan called the Clean Power Plan, and it deals with mandates by the environmental protection agencies that states have to reduce their greenhouse gases by up to 30% over a certain period of time. So the question in Kansas was, are we going to write our own plan, or are we going to let the feds do it for us? And there was a lot of give and take, and what should we do, and whatever in the chamber. And a lot of people said, don't do anything. Let the feds write it for us. A lot of our state legislators said, no, we want to write our own plan. And we have an 11-member legislative committee that will be monitoring this and looking at the plans and seeing what the filings go to EPA. And I'm glad to see that Marcy's here because I think she's going to be on it, and a stellar voice for. But the basic provisions of this really are 3 or 4 things. One is that we're going to burn more natural gas and less coal. So that's where we're headed with that. We are going to see expansion, I think, of renewables, and we're going to take credit for all the wind farms are going to play into helping us with our greenhouse emissions. The other option that we have, which we've really done dreadfully with that thing, is energy efficiency in the state of Kansas. If you look at the 50 states across our country, we've been about 45th in having any energy conservation programs provided by the state or by utilities. So, and we really don't have much of a clue as how well or how we use electricity in the state of Kansas. We have 1.2 million occupied housing units in the state of Kansas. A third of those are rentals, 400,000. We've never grappled with renters pay utility bills, but they don't control the property. So how do you get energy efficiency into that setting at this point? And 70% of our homes are heated by natural gas, 20% by electricity, and then 8% propane and some others. Probably the most reluctant utility that's been a player in looking at conservation efficiency is Kansas Gas Service. And they serve they serve most of that 70%. So we've got to bring them to the table. They have a guaranteed service area. They want a rate of return on their equity of 10%, as does Westar and KCP&L as well. But who doesn't want 10% in 1% return, on your CDs these days? What goes with that responsibility? What goes with being a monopoly in this service area? What does efficiency? The law says they have to provide efficient and sufficient service. We need a new definition of efficient in the year 2015 than when it was passed in the 1930s. But on to water. Our state's had a water plan for the last 20 years. It's a state water plan. And it helps with conservation, and it helps with a number of items. Once again, the budget deficit comes into play here. It should be in the range of $25 to $28 million a year is the state water plan. Of that, we should be taking $6 million from the state general fund, put it in the water plan. We should be taking $2 million from economic lottery proceeds, put in the state water plan. We've stopped that for the last 4 years at this point. So we're at a $14 million water plan. This comes at the time when the governor wants a 50-year vision on what we're going to do with water in the state of Kansas. And after meeting a lot of environmental groups and people, we've met with the Kansas Water Office and Department of Ag on this a couple times. We finally got them to change the title from a water vision to a water supply vision because that's what they're concerned about. And there's really two items. What's going to happen with the Ogallala in western Kansas, and what's going to happen with our reservoirs, which supply a bulk of the drinking water for about 1.6 million Kansans at this point. We've used somewhere close to 40% of the water out of the Ogallala at this point, and K-State predicts that at present rates we'll use 70% by 2050. We have about 35,000 water rights issued in that area, and they're over-appropriated. We have given away so many water rights that we're inevitably going to drain the Ogallala. So the question is, how do we undo that? How do we buy back water rights? How do we figure out ways, my attitude is when that land turns over for sale, that the new owner ought to understand that they're going to get 20% or 25% less water. But good luck getting that in this legislature at this point. And the federal reservoirs, Tom Sloan, people have spent a lot of time talking about, a lot of them are silting in. They're 40, 50 years old. They were built on flat land. We didn't have great places in the state of Kansas to build federal reservoirs, and it's coming due in a certain way. We've now put out $20 million for John Redmond Reservoir to start dredging it. And the reason we need to dredge John Redmond Reservoir is it's the backup cooling water for the Wolf Creek Nuclear Power Plant. And so we're going to start pulling sludge out of that and put it somewhere, and see. And then the other thing is, we spent $300,000 over the last year studying the Kansas aqueduct that's going to go from northeast Kansas, White Cloud, out to middle of western Kansas, 300 miles, $17 billion. They assume that when the water gets to that reservoir out in western Kansas, it'll be $450 an acre foot. Good luck growing corn or anything with 450. Okay, a little bit on to agriculture, and then I'll start wrapping it up. It's dangerous giving a lobbyist a microphone, but it's hard to overstate how fundamentally agriculture has changed in our state and in my lifetime, in that. Since 1980, we've lost 90% of our hog farms. We've lost 90% of our dairies. But they're somewhat minor players. Beef is really the big deal in the state of Kansas. We have about $14-15 billion in farm sales a year, and $8 billion of that is beef related. And then you go down from there, some grains, and with $500 million of pork and $560 million of dairy. But Kansas is one of 8 states that still has some restrictions on corporate agriculture. And this really applies to mega corporate hog confinement facilities. And if Seaboard or a Tyson wants to come into a county and build and own a facility, they have to get a county resolution passed to be able to do that. And you can do it by vote, or you can do it by the county commissioners agreeing to it. We've had 20 votes in this state on that issue, and all 20 counties voted down allowing corporate hogs. One of them changed, Greeley County. They voted 412 to 405, the 1,300 residents in Greeley County, to allow Seaboard to come in and build a facility called Ladder Creek. It has 180,000 hogs today, and they've got permission to take it to 250 to 300,000 hogs. How many people do you think want to live very close to that situation? I go in more. They built it in some of the worst drought area in our state to start with, so they don't have enough water to dilute the stuff coming out of these hog barns, and how to handle it and where to put it, and that's for another day. But let me talk about a happier note here on all of this. A year ago, the Rural Center and some other people, with the help of Marcy again, got a bill passed to set up a local food and farm task force in our state. And we have 7 members that are spending the year 2015 looking at local food and farm issues. And they're going to bring a report back to the state legislature next January. And it's somewhat modeled on, there's some wonderful state plans you can see in Iowa and Michigan and North Carolina, people who've done really systematic analysis of their food situation. And I could share a lot of numbers with you about it, but I'll give you a couple. USDA assumes that an average Kansan spends $260 a year on fruits and vegetables. So you take that times 3 million, you're getting about $770 million a year Kansans are spending on fruits and vegetables. We grow 4% of that locally. 32 million out of 770 million is all we're growing at this point. Now, if we had a 10% goal or a 15% goal, that would be $100 or $120 million in local produce. What would we do if an industry walked in and said, I want to spend $120 million, but, and half your food plate, USDA good diet, is fruits and vegetables. And we barely are at 10% of our Kansans who meet that at this point. Okay, 2 or 3 things on election laws and a couple others. So the law is now passed, and we're moving our local spring elections to the fall, starting in 2017. And the compromise was that in odd number years, we're going to have the municipal and school board elections, along with a lot of other districts, and they'll be nonpartisan. Now, if a municipality wants it to be partisan, they can do that, but that. And then on the even number years will be the partisan races at this point. So we'll see what difference that makes. I think we're gonna test, you know, when you look at the $30 million that was dumped in this ridiculous governor's race that we saw last, you know, are we going to have $30 million school board races? I mean, what's it going to take dollar-wise to turn out voters? I guess is part of it. We've now passed Senate Bill 34, so our great Secretary of State and our Attorney General can now prosecute election crimes. And by the way, we strengthened some of the election crimes. And we're also kind of debating what happens with people who are in these provisional ballots, or they're kind of, you know, semi-voters at, you know, at this point. You know, what's the legality of that? I think the photo ID issue probably is settled in Kansas. I don't think we're going to reform or change that back at this point. And we just passed 2183, which was a hodgepodge of many election items. But one of the items in that now is decided that the state can overrule any political sign ordinances by city or county government. It's another area where state of Kansas knows best. And the state of Kansas knows best with concealed weapons. Local units can't regulate that, can't do that. So let me end on a couple victories here. I think that it is somewhat of a victory that we don't have a second coal plant at Holcomb, Kansas. And I think there were a lot of people in battles on that. Some of it's money, some of it's question whether if Sunflower wants to build that, they're going to have to get a lot of subsidized money out of USDA to do it, and they're probably not going to do that at this point, depending on what happens with the next presidential. The other victory really is that the governor wanted to change our selection of Kansas Supreme Court justices. And, well, we did it with the Court of Appeals. So now he selects and the Senate confirms. But that was a statutory provision. But to do it for the Kansas Supreme Court, you have to have a constitutional amendment. That takes 84 votes in the House. Those two resolutions to change that, either to election or to approval by the Senate, has been on the House calendar the whole year. And there's never been a run or a try at it because they don't have 84 votes to move that constitutional amendment. So that's my polemics for the time being.